December 6th, 1240. It is just before dawn, and the city of Kyiv is already burning. Not slowly, not the way a candle burns down while you sleep. Kyiv is burning the way a civilization burns all at once everywhere, with no one left to put it out. The Church of the Tithes, the oldest stone church in all of Kyivan Rus, a building that had stood for 2.5 centuries, is packed wall to wall with survivors. Men, women, children, priests, soldiers with arrows still in their bodies. They crowd onto the upper balconies, clutching icons, praying in whispers. The stone floor beneath them is cold. The stone walls around them are shaking. And then the balcony gives way. It collapses under the weight of the people standing on it, a crack, a roar, and then silence. Hundreds of people were crushed in the very house of God which they had run to for salvation. The chronicles would record it without commentary. There was no commentary to give. Outside in the street, a man named Dmytro, the military commander of Kiev, the last line of defense for one of the greatest cities in the medieval world, is still fighting. He has an arrow through him. He knows the battle is already lost. He fights anyway. The Mongols are inside the walls now. They have been inside the walls since yesterday. 9 days, that is all it took to break open a city of 50,000 people. 9 days of bombardment. 9 days of stone and fire raining down from machines the Rus had never seen before. 9 days to end 3 centuries of history. By the time the sun fully rises on December 6th, it is over. The streets of Kiev are silent except for the sound of the conquerors moving through them. Out of 50,000 people who had called this city home, fewer than 2,000 will survive. Dmytro is dragged wounded before Batu Khan himself. The great Mongol commander looks at this broken man who refused to stop fighting and does something remarkable. He orders him set free. A gesture of respect so rare in these campaigns that every chronicler who heard the story wrote it down. But the city Dmytro had bled for that would not be spared. Now I need you to ask yourself something. How does a civilization that was by every measure the most powerful in Eastern Europe, a state larger than France, Germany, and England combined, end up here? How do you get from a thriving, literate, culturally sophisticated world power to a city of 2,000 survivors in less than 4 years? The answer is not simply the Mongols showed up. The Mongols showed up everywhere. What happened here was something far more specific, far more tragic, and honestly far more instructive than most history books want to admit. Stay with me. Because this story does not start in 1237. It starts with a decision made almost 2 centuries earlier by a man who thought he was doing the right thing. Before we go back to the beginning, let me tell you what you are going to see in this video. You are going to see the most devastating military campaign in the history of medieval Europe, conducted in winter on purpose by an army that used frozen rivers as highways. You are going to meet the greatest general in the history of the world, a man so obese he could no longer ride a horse, who was therefore carried into battle on a wagon, and who still outmaneuvered every opponent he ever faced. You are going to witness what might be the single most heroic act of collective resistance in the entire medieval record. A town of 4,000 ordinary people who made the most feared military force on earth bleed for 7 weeks straight. And you are going to watch a civilization destroy itself from the inside long before the Mongols ever arrived. So let us go back. Back to where it all started to go wrong. In the early 11th century, Kyivan Rus was extraordinary. I want you to really understand that, because popular history has a tendency to reduce this part of the world to a kind of prehistory, a vague, cold, dangerous place that existed mainly as a backdrop before Russia really began. That is wrong. Kyivan Rus, at its peak, was one of the most sophisticated states in the entire medieval world. Its capital, Kyiv, sat on the high western bank of the Dnieper River, with a population of 50,000 people, larger than Paris, at the time, larger than London. It had universities. It had a written legal code, the Russkaya Pravda, which was genuinely progressive for its era. It rejected capital punishment for free citizens, confined punishments to fines, and accorded women rights of property and inheritance that women in Western Europe would not see for centuries. Novgorod had a sewage system. In the 12th century. The literacy rate in Kiev and Novgorod was remarkable by medieval standards. And at the center of all this was a dynasty, the Rurikids, descended from Varangian Viking traders who had come down from the north, taken root in the river cities, and built something genuinely remarkable from the confluence of Slavic culture, Byzantine religion, and Norse organizational energy. Under Vladimir the Great and his son Yaroslav the Wise, Kyivan Rus reached its apex. Trade routes from Constantinople to the Baltic ran straight through Kiev. Orthodox Christianity knit the cities together with shared ritual, shared language, and shared law. For about 50 years it worked. Then Yaroslav the Wise died in 1054, and he made a decision that would haunt his descendants for 200 years. He divided his lands among his sons. Now on paper, this is perfectly reasonable. Medieval rulers did it all the time. Divide the inheritance, keep the peace, give everyone a stake. The problem is what happened next, and kept happening. Each son left the territory to his sons, who divided it further, who fought each other for the best parcels, whose sons fought each other for the remainder. By the 12th century, what had once been one state was a patchwork of competing principalities. Vladimir, Suzdal, Chernigov, Smolensk, Ryazan, Galicia, Volhynia, Novgorod, Kiev itself, each ruled by a branch of the Rurik family. Each convinced that it was the legitimate heir to the whole thing, and each therefore willing to burn down a cousin city to prove the point. The Cuman's nomadic steppe warriors from the south and east raided constantly, and rather than uniting against them, the Russian princes did something almost magnificently stupid. They hired the Cumans to fight their other Russian cousins. Enemy of my enemy and all that. By the time the 13th century rolled around, the princes of Rus had been so thoroughly conditioned to see each other as the primary threat that they had essentially no framework for dealing with anything coming from outside. They had everything they needed to survive what was coming, except for the one thing that actually mattered: the ability to act like a single country. I'll be honest with you. When I study this period, I find it genuinely difficult to generate sympathy for the ruling class of Kyivan Rus. They were warned repeatedly, and they chose every single time their own short-term political advantage over the survival of their civilization. That is not a medieval problem. That is a human problem. And we will see it play out again and again in this story. While the princes of Rus quarreled over river cities and inheritance disputes, something was happening on the other side of the world that would make all of their arguments completely irrelevant. In the year 1206, a man named Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler, over a unified Mongol nation. Within 20 years, that nation had conquered more territory than the Roman Empire at its height. And by 1235, the leadership of the Mongol Empire had turned its eyes west. The man who would actually plan the conquest of Kyivan Rus was not Batu Khan. Batu Khan was the nominal commander-grandson of Genghis, son of Jochi, the prince who had been given all lands west of the Volga as his inheritance. He was the flag. He was the name on the masthead. But the architect of everything that happened between 1237 and 1242 was a man named Subutai. Subutai Bahadur. Let me tell you about Subutai. In a reasonable world, this man would be as famous as Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great combined. He directed more than 20 campaigns over a career spanning 4 decades. He conquered personally, strategically, tactically more territory than any military commander in the history of the human species. By the end of his career, he was so heavy he could no longer ride a horse. So they put him in a carriage, and he continued to win. His genius was not brute force, though force was certainly available. His genius was information. Before the invasion of Eastern Europe, Subutai spent the better part of a decade sending agents, merchants, travelers, diplomats deep into the heart of the continent. They came back with maps of old Roman roads, records of trade routes, detailed assessments of each principality, its wealth, its military capacity, its relationships with its neighbors, how likely it was to call for help when attacked, and how quickly that help might actually arrive. When Batu's army crossed the Volga in 1237, they did not cross into an unknown land. They crossed into a land they understood better in some ways than its own rulers did. At the Kurultai of 1235, the great council of Mongol princes, The decision had been made to conquer all lands west to the ultimate sea. Ögedei Khan, Genghis's successor as Great Khan, sent Batu Munkaguyuk and a constellation of other Chingizid princes, each leading their own Tumen's units of roughly 10,000 cavalry. Total force estimates range from 120,000 to 140,000 men. Most of them were not ethnically Mongol. They were Turkic auxiliaries, captured warriors from the Cumans and the Bulgars, Chinese siege engineers. But every single one of them was organized according to Mongol principles of disciplined mobility and unified command. The Mongol army that crossed into Rus in 1237 was not, and this is a point that gets lost in popular imagination, a horde of wild barbarians operating on instinct and ferocity. It was the most sophisticated military organization on earth. The word horde itself is a translation of the Mongolian ordu, which simply means camp or headquarters. The Mongol military was structured with a precision that would not look out of place in a modern staff college. The decimal system units of 10, 100, 1,000 and 10,000 created a chain of command that was simultaneously flexible and coherent. Every officer knew his position. Every unit knew its role. Every soldier knew what was expected of him in every contingency, because the contingencies had been anticipated, trained for, and rehearsed. The individual Mongol soldier was, by the standards of any army in the world at that time, extraordinarily capable. He maintained 3 to 5 horses, not one, which allowed him to switch mounts constantly and maintain speeds that no European or Russian cavalry force could match over any sustained distance. In some phases of the European campaign, Mongol units covered distances of 60 to 100 miles per day. To put that in context, a medieval European army on a good road in good weather might cover 15 miles. Each Mongol soldier was also essentially self-sufficient. He could subsist on dried meat and mare's milk for days without a supply line, which meant the army did not have the logistical tail that made European armies so slow and so predictable. And then there were the siege weapons. This is the detail that most surprised the Rus, and most surprised the Europeans who heard about it later. The Mongols were not just cavalry. They had, through their conquests in China, acquired a corps of Chinese siege engineers who travelled with the army and operated sophisticated trebuchets, battering rams, and incendiary weapons, including, according to some sources, an early form of gunpowder-based projectile. The Rus cities had been built to defend against cavalry raids. They were not built to withstand sustained, technically sophisticated siege warfare. When Batu's siege engines appeared outside Ryazan, the defenders were facing technology they had genuinely never encountered. That is not a metaphor. The literal machines being used against them were unknown to their military tradition. The psychological dimension of the Mongol approach deserves its own mention. They had developed over decades of campaigning a system of terror that was as carefully calibrated as their logistics. When a city submitted without resistance, it was generally treated with comparative leniency. Its people were assessed for tribute. Its craftsmen were sometimes taken east to serve the empire. But the city survived. When a city resisted and was taken by force, the standard practice was total destruction. Every person killed, every building burned, and survivors sent to spread the message to the next city. This was not random cruelty. It was a deliberate policy designed to reduce the total cost of conquest by making the first few examples so horrifying that subsequent targets would calculate submission as the rational choice. It worked reliably across every theatre the Mongols operated in, except, as we will see, in a few extraordinary places. And they had a secret weapon, one that no one saw coming. Winter. Everyone who has ever studied Russian military history knows about general winter, the idea that Russia's brutal cold is its greatest natural defense. Napoleon learned this. Hitler learned this. But here is a detail that most people never encounter. The only successful winter invasion of Russia in history was carried out by the Mongols, on purpose, because they wanted it to be winter. The Rus principalities fought in the summer. Their armies mobilized in the summer. Their supply lines ran in the summer. Their tactical thinking was built around the summer. The Mongols, by contrast, were nomadic steppe people who found the Russian winter landscape familiar, open, frozen, treeless in places with rivers turned to solid highways. that could support tens of thousands of horses moving at speed. The same rivers that normally divided and compartmentalized the Russian principalities, making coordinated defense difficult, became the Mongols' roads. They did not have to go around obstacles. They rode straight through them. By the autumn of 1237, Batu's army had already spent a year subduing the Volga Bulgars, the Cumans, and the Alans. The steppe was secured, the springboard was ready, and the temperature was dropping. Before we get to the invasion itself, we have to talk about 1223, because in 1223, the princes of Kyivan Rus were given the most explicit warning in the history of military intelligence, and they threw it away. That year, Subutai and another Mongol general named Steppe led a force of roughly 30,000 cavalry on what the Mongols described as a reconnaissance, a scouting expedition into the Western territories. They came through the Caucasus, smashed through Georgia and Azerbaijan, swept around the Caspian Sea, and appeared on the northern edge of the Black Sea steppe. The Cumans, the same nomadic warriors the Russian princes had been fighting and hiring for a century, suddenly came riding hard to the Rus cities, asking for help. "There is a people we have never seen," they said. "They came from we know not where. They have already destroyed everyone in their path. We ask you as brothers, help us fight them, or they will come for you next." The princes of Rus held a council in Kiev, and to their credit, they made a reasonable decision. They agreed to help. 80,000 soldiers, a coalition, including forces from Kiev, Galicia, Volhynia, Chernihiv, Smolensk, and Kursk, marched south with their Cuman allies to meet this mysterious enemy. On May 31, 1223, on the banks of the Kalka River, in what is now eastern Ukraine, they found them. The battle that followed was a catastrophe on a scale that the Rus had never experienced. Subutai used the tactic he would deploy over and over again across 40 years of campaigning: the feigned retreat. The Mongol cavalry appeared, skirmished briefly, then turned and fled, pulling the Rus princes forward in pursuit, breaking their formation, stretching their line. And then the trap closed. The flanks folded in. The arrow storm began. The pursuit became a slaughter. The Novgorod First Chronicle. The most reliable contemporary source says that only 1 in 10 soldiers made it home. 1 in 10. The Rus princes who survived fled on horseback. The ones who were captured, including the Grand Prince of Kiev, Mstislav Romanovich, received the treatment the Mongols reserved for royalty. They were tied up, laid flat on the ground, and wooden platforms were placed on top of them. Subutai and his commanders sat down to a victory banquet on top of the living, slowly dying bodies of the Rus princes. No blood was spilled. That was technically mercy by the Mongol code. After this battle, after 9 out of 10 soldiers from a multi-principality coalition had been killed or scattered, the Mongols simply left. They rode back east and disappeared over the horizon. And you know what the princes of Rus did over the next 13 years? They fought each other. The same old disputes over the same river towns. Not a single serious effort to build shared defences. Not a single alliance formed to prepare for a return that everyone knew was coming. History had given them a warning written in blood, and they used it as wallpaper. A Hungarian friar named Julian travelled to the eastern border of Rus in 1237, just months before the invasion began, and wrote back to the Pope describing exactly what was about to happen. He had talked to Mongol messengers. He had seen the army massing east of the Volga. He warned that they were waiting for the rivers to freeze. His letter reached Rome. It did not reach the princes in time, or rather it reached them, and they did nothing. In November 1237, Batu Khan sent envoys to the court of Yuri II, Grand Prince of Vladimir, the most powerful ruler in northeastern Rus, and delivered an ultimatum: submit, pay tribute, and be spared. Yuri II's response, according to the Laurentian Chronicle, was essentially no. He dismissed the envoys with contempt. The chronicler, writing approvingly, quotes the sentiment, "Glorious war is better than a disgraceful peace. Glorious war is better than a disgraceful peace." I want you to hold on to that phrase, because in about 90 days, it is going to age very poorly. Yuri II did not send aid to his neighbours. He did not mobilize a coalition defense. He sent a token force south to show good faith toward the smaller principality of Ryazan. and then he waited, apparently convinced that the Mongols would slow down once they hit proper resistance. Ryazan was a mid-sized city on the Oka River southeast of Vladimir. Its Prince Yuri Igorovich, who knew what was coming. He sent urgent pleas to Vladimir and to Chernihiv asking for armies. Both cities declined Chernihiv, citing its own disputes, and Vladimir sending a small contingent that arrived after it was already too late. Ryazan was in the end completely alone. Before the attack, Batu sent envoys of his own to demand the standard Mongol tribute, 1/10 of everything. Livestock goods, silver, and also notably 1/10 of the princes themselves and 1/10 of the women. Ryazan's response was defiant. When we are all dead, everything will be yours. Prince Fyodor Yuri's son was part of the delegation sent to negotiate. He refused Batu's demand for his own wife. He was executed on the spot. The siege began on December 16, 1237. For 5 days, Ryazan held. The chronicles describe the defenders fighting on the walls with extraordinary courage, outnumbered perhaps 10 to 1 or more. The Mongol siege engines, Chinese-designed trebuchets, battering rams, catapults loaded with burning pitch, worked methodically around the perimeter of the wooden walls. By December 21st, they had breached them. What followed is described in the Russian chronicles in language so spare it becomes almost unbearable. They burned it all and killed its prince and his princess, and seized the men and women and children. Some they struck down with swords, while others they shot with arrows and flung into the flames. No one in the town remained alive, all died equally and drank the single cup of death. The churches of Ryazan, filled with the sick and the elderly who could not flee, were burned with the people still inside. Ryazan was never rebuilt. The ruins were abandoned. The modern Russian city called Ryazan today is a different settlement entirely, in a different location. Old Ryazan ceased to exist on December 21st, 1237, and never came back. And Grand Prince Yuri II of Vladimir, sitting safely in his palace roughly 200 miles north now, had the full and complete picture of what was marching toward him. He had watched a major Rus city be annihilated in 5 days, a city that had explicitly asked him for help, which he had mostly declined to provide. I will tell you what he did next. He sent his sons south to slow the Mongols down. They were defeated in open battle near Kolomna in early January. The Mongols burned Moscow, at the time a minor fortified settlement, on their way north. And then Batu turned his full attention toward Vladimir. What happened between January and March of 1238 is one of the most terrifying displays of military efficiency in the medieval record. The Mongols did not advance in a single column. They spread like water, finding every crack in a stone, with multiple detachments operating simultaneously across a front hundreds of miles wide, each operating independently, each capable of taking and destroying a fortified city on its own. Kolomna fell in early January. Moscow fell shortly after. And on February 4th, 1238, the Mongols arrived outside the walls of Vladimir. Vladimir was the capital of the most powerful principality in northeastern Rus. It had stone churches, a stone Kremlin, substantial walls, and a population in the tens of thousands. It was, by any reasonable expectation, the kind of city that should have been able to hold out for months. Grand Prince Yuri II was no longer there. He had fled north across the Volga to gather a new army, leaving the defense of his own capital to his sons Vsevolod and Mstislav and the city commander. Before the siege began, the Mongols executed Vladimir Yuri's son, who had been captured when Moscow fell right in front of the city walls, in clear view of the defenders. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare. The message was not subtle. Vladimir fell on February 7th. 3 days. The royal family had retreated into the Cathedral of the Assumption, the same gesture that would repeat itself across every city in this campaign, as if the walls of a church might stop what the walls of a fortress could not. They burned to death inside it. Suzdal was sacked the same week. Then, the Mongol army divided with the precision of a machine into separate columns that fanned out across the Vladimir-Suzdal Principality and took 14 cities in the span of a few weeks: Rostov, Yaroslavl, Uglich, Tver, Kostroma, Galich, Kashin, and more. Simultaneously, without any of them being able to coordinate a defense or send help to the others. Yuri II had crossed the Volga with his brothers and was mustering a new army on the Sit River, waiting for reinforcements from his northern allies, hoping to gather enough men to push back. He sent 3,000 cavalry under a commander named Dorosh to scout the Mongol position. Dorosh rode out. Dorosh rode back. "Prince," he said, "we are already surrounded." The Mongol general Burundai had outflanked them completely, sweeping around through the forests, while Yuri's army was still assembling, cutting off every line of retreat. On March 4, 1238, at the Battle of the Sit River, the last organized Rus army in the northeast was destroyed. Yuri II died in the fighting. His nephew Vsevolod of Yaroslavl died alongside him. Prince Vasilko of Rostov was captured and later killed for refusing to renounce Christianity. The head of Grand Prince Yuri II, the man who had declared that glorious war was better than a disgraceful peace, was brought to Batu Khan. In less than 90 days from the fall of Ryazan, the most powerful principality in northeastern Kyivan Rus had ceased to exist as a functioning military force. 14 cities sacked. The field army was annihilated. The royal family is dead. And this was only the first phase. I want to slow down for a moment and describe what it actually felt like to be inside one of those 14 cities when the Mongols arrived, because the chronicles give us enough detail to reconstruct it. And I think it is important to understand this as something that happened to real people, not just as a line on a map with an arrow. Take Yaroslavl. It was a prosperous city on the Volga, a trading hub, a center of religious life with monasteries and craftsmen, and a population that had been building its life there for generations. In the winter of 1238, the citizens of Yaroslavl woke up one morning to the news from the east. The news was always the same: another city taken, another city gone. The stories arriving from survivors, because some always survived to flee, and that too was deliberate part of the terror system, described things that were difficult to process. Machines that threw rocks so large they knocked down stone walls. Cavalry that seemed to materialize from every direction at once. Fire that stuck to wooden buildings and could not be extinguished with water. The citizens of Yaroslavl had no way to know whether their city was next, or whether the column heading their way would turn towards somewhere else. They had no communication with other cities. The Mongol tactic of simultaneous multi-column assault had deliberately severed the messenger networks that Rus cities relied on. If you sent a rider east to find out where the enemy was, that rider might ride straight into a Mongol patrol 20 miles outside the city walls and never return. If you sent a rider to Vladimir asking for help, you might get back the news that Vladimir no longer existed. The isolation was complete, and it was engineered. This is something Subutai had specifically designed the campaign to produce. By dividing into multiple independent columns operating across a front several hundred miles wide, he ensured that no Rus city had any clear picture of where the main force was, how large it was, or how far away it was. The defenders of each city made their calculations in near total informational darkness. And without information, even brave people tend to make defensive rather than offensive choices. They hold their walls and wait rather than marching out to join a coalition they do not know is forming. The military fragmentation of Kyivan Rus was a pre-existing condition. Subutai's operational design turned that condition into a fatal one. I think about Yuri II sometimes. He was not a coward. He did not run from the Sit River. He was there fighting until the end. But he had made decision after decision in the preceding months that made the final outcome almost inevitable, each one reasonable on its own terms, each one part of a pattern of thinking that prioritized local autonomy over collective survival. He is in a way the perfect symbol of everything wrong with Kyivan Rus in 1237. Brave enough to die for his principality, not wise enough to live for his civilization. And here, if you want to drop a comment, I am genuinely curious what you think. If the Rus princes had somehow managed to form a unified coalition defense in 1237, could they have stopped the Mongols? Or was this outcome inevitable regardless? Let me know below. After the Battle of the Sit River, the Mongol army turned north toward Novgorod, the great merchant republic, the richest city in Rus, a prize that would have given Batu control of the entire Baltic trade network. They got within about 100 kilometers of it, and then they stopped. The reasons are still debated by historians, but the most convincing explanation is simple logistics. It was late February, the spring thaw was beginning, and the frozen rivers that had been Batu's highways were starting to become mud traps. Novgorod was surrounded by swamps and dense forest terrain, entirely unsuited to Mongol cavalry tactics. The army turned south. Novgorod alone among the great Rus cities would survive this campaign untouched, less through any heroism of its own, more through a combination of geography and fortunate timing. On their way back south toward the steppe, the Mongols swept through the remnants of the Vladimir Suzdal Principality, destroying whatever had been left standing, and somewhere in the late winter of 1238, near the end of what had been a 5-month campaign of nearly unbroken victory, they arrived before a town most of them had probably never heard of. Kozelsk. Kozelsk was a minor city, a subsidiary princely centre in the Chernihiv Principality, situated on a bend of the Zhizdra River in what is now the Kaluga region of Russia. Its population was approximately 4,000 people. It was ruled by a boy named Vasily Titovich, who was 12 years old. On every measurable axis size, wealth, military importance, political significance, it was completely unremarkable. The Mongols arrived in late March 1238. Ryazan had lasted 6 days, Moscow days, Vladimir 4 days. Torzhok, a substantially larger and better fortified city, had held for 2 weeks and been considered impressive for it. The people of Kozelsk called an assembly, the Vech, the traditional Rus town council, in which all free male citizens had a voice, and they made a decision. Their prince was a child, they said. They had no outside help coming. They knew exactly what awaited them if they refused, and they decided to resist anyway. The words attributed to them in the chronicle are extraordinary in their clarity. Our prince is young, but we shall die for him, leaving behind a glorious name, and for the next world, the crown of martyrdom. They meant it. Week 1 passed. The Mongols attacked the earthen ramparts and the wooden palisade walls and were repelled. Week 2 passed. The spring flooding around the city's hill was making it increasingly difficult to deploy the heavy siege engines close enough to do real damage. Week 3. Week 4. The Mongol army, fresh from destroying 14 cities in as many weeks, was stuck outside a town of 4,000 ordinary people. At some point in the siege, the Kozelsk defenders had captured or destroyed some of the Mongol siege equipment. The chronicles describe a final sortie, 300 men, the last fighting men of Kozelsk, pouring out of the gates with swords directly into the Mongol camp. They destroyed catapults. They killed 4,000 Mongol soldiers, including, the sources claim, 3 sons of Mongol generals, Chingizid noblesmen of significant rank. All 300 defenders died, every one of them. But Kozelsk still did not fall. The town was only taken when Batu's cousins, Kyivan and Buri, arrived with fresh reinforcements after 7 weeks of siege. 3 days after that, with new troops and new equipment, Kozelsk fell. The Mongols killed everyone inside, the chronicles say, sparing not even the infants. The young prince Vasily was said to have drowned in blood. Batu Khan was furious in the specific way that a man is furious when something small and contemptible refuses to behave according to the laws of power. He issued an order no one was to speak the name Kozelsk. The town was to be referred to henceforth only as Ikan Bolgusun, in Mongol, the evil city, or in some translations, the city of woe. The remarkable thing is that this epithet survived. Rashid al-Din, the Persian historian writing 60 years after the events, confirms it. The Arabic sources confirm it. A small town of 4,000 people led by a 12-year-old without allies or hope had so thoroughly disrupted the greatest military machine in human history that its commander, a man who had conquered half a continent, chose to erase its name from memory rather than allow it to exist as a symbol of resistance. I need to be direct with you. Kozelsk is one of my favorite stories in all of military history, and I think it deserves to be far better known than it is. 4,000 ordinary people decided that dignity mattered more than survival. They did not stop the Mongols. Nothing was going to stop the Mongols at that point, but they made them bleed. They made them spend 7 weeks in a city that should have taken a day. They killed 4,000 of the most feared soldiers in the world, and they forced Batu Khan, a man who had destroyed empires, to resort to erasing their name because he couldn't stand that they had won the only thing you can win when everything else is lost, the argument about character. The ruins of Kozelsk are still there today. In 2009, the Russian government awarded the town the title City of Military Glory, 770 years later. Better late than never. If this channel has ever given you a story worth sharing, this one is it. Hit that like button and pass it along. Kozelsk deserves to be known. After Kozelsk, the Mongol army dissolved back into the steppe. The summer of 1238 passed, then the autumn, then the winter, then all of 1239's spring and summer. Batu needed the time. The 5-month campaign through northeastern Rus had been extraordinarily successful, but it had also cost the army real losses. Horses needed to recover. Equipment needs to be rebuilt. The conquered territories around the Black Sea and Crimea needed to be pacified and organized into a functioning tribute system. In 1238, the Mongols swept through the Crimea, pacified Mordovia, and continued their campaign against the Cumans and Alans on the southern steppe. By every military measure, this pause was rational and necessary. Now let me tell you what the surviving princes of Rus did with 2 years and a very clear warning about what was coming. Almost nothing. There is no record of a serious attempt to rebuild the northern defences. There is no record of a new coalition being formed between the surviving principalities, Chernihiv, Kyiv, Galicia, Volhynia, Smolensk and Novgorod. There is no evidence that anyone used this breathing room to stockpile supplies, reinforce walls, or organize a coordinated military response. The old patterns reasserted themselves almost immediately: territorial disputes, competition over political influence, the endless choreography of medieval dynastic maneuvering. In 1239, Batu returned. Pereyaslav fell in March 1239. Its prince was killed in the fighting. Chernihiv, one of the great cities of southern Rus, a city of 30,000 people, was besieged in October 1239 and taken after a fierce defense. When Mongol envoys had arrived before the siege demanding surrender, Grand Prince Michael of Chernihiv had ordered them executed. It was the same mistake that had been made before, and it produced the same result. Michael himself fled the city while it was still burning, riding hard for Hungary, where he hoped to convince King Bela IV to send military help. Hungary declined. Poland declined. Everyone declined. The Western European powers looked east at the smoke rising over the steppe and made the same calculation every time that was someone else's problem, and perhaps the Mongols would stop before they got to us. After Chernihiv fell, a scramble broke out over the last great prize, Kiev. The Smolensk prince Rostislav Mstislavich rushed in to claim the title of its ruler. He was promptly driven out by Danilo Romanovich, Daniel of Galicia Volhynia, who captured Kyiv and appointed a military commander named Dmitro to hold it. Then Danilo himself left for Hungary, also to seek help, also to find none. Kyiv now stood with its appointed defender, its ordinary citizens, its 40 churches and its ancient walls, and the full knowledge that what had erased every other major city in Rus was coming for it next. The Mongols had given Rus 2 years, 2 years that were almost entirely wasted. Let me paint a picture for you of Kiev in the late autumn of 1240, before Batu's army arrived. It was still by any measure a magnificent city. 40 major buildings. The Cathedral of St. Sophia, with its mosaic floors and golden domes, was commissioned by Yaroslav the Wise to rival the Hagia Sophia of Constantinople. The Church of the Tithes, the first stone church in Rus built under Vladimir the Great, which had stood since the year 996. Libraries, monasteries, markets and the artisan quarters along the riverbank, where craftsmen produced metalwork and ceramics that were exported across the known world. a population of 50,000 people who had been for most of their lives citizens of the greatest city in Eastern Europe. And at the center of it all, a military commander named Dmytro, a voivode, a war leader who had been left in charge of the defense with whatever forces the city could muster by a prince who was elsewhere seeking help that would not come. The political situation was, even by Russian standards, absurdly chaotic. Michael of Chernihiv had been the most recent Grand Prince with any real authority over Kiev, but he had been in exile since 1239. Rostislav had grabbed the title briefly. Danilo had expelled Rostislav. Danilo had then left. The city had changed effective rulers 3 times in roughly a year, and the man now technically defending it was a loyal officer without a functioning political sponsor. In autumn 1240, the Mongol vanguard under Mungka Khan Batu's cousin appeared on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River and looked across at Kyiv. What happened next is one of those small moments of humanity that appear unexpectedly in the most savage historical records. Mungka Khan, looking at Kyiv from the opposite bank, was apparently struck by the beauty of the city. He sent envoys across with an offer surrender, peacefully submit to Mongol authority, and the city would be spared. The population would be permitted to live. Dmytro had those envoys killed. Whether this was bravery or madness is a question I genuinely do not know how to answer. Kyiv had watched every other Rus city make the same choice, refuse submission, fight to the end and be annihilated. There was absolutely no reason to believe that the result this time would be different. And yet, the order was given, the envoys died, the offer was withdrawn, and the whole of Batu's army, not just the vanguard, but the full force, crossed the Dnieper and encamped outside the city walls. The contemporary Russian chronicle describes the scene outside the walls of Kyiv in terms that almost defy imagination. The squeaking of wagons, the bellowing of camels, the sounds of trumpets and organs, the neighing of horses, and the cries and sobs of an innumerable multitude of people made it impossible for anyone in the city to hear one another speak. The entire country was overflowing with the Tartars. It reads less like a military account and more like a description of the end of the world, which for Kyiv it was. Before the bombardment began, one of the Kyivans managed to capture a Mongol soldier named Tovrul, and he gave the defenders something genuinely useful: the names and positions of every senior commander in the Mongol army outside the gates. Kyiv's defenders knew exactly who they were facing. It did not change the math, but it gave them the dignity of knowing their enemy by name. Batu also sent a fast column to intercept the Chorny Klobaki, a semi-nomadic Turkic people who had been allies of Kyiv for generations and were reportedly riding to its relief. They were destroyed before they reached the city. Kyiv would face what was coming entirely alone. November 28, 1240. The Mongol engineers positioned their trebuchets near the Lyadsky Gate, the southern gate of Old Kyiv, where the tree line runs almost up to the city walls. This is deliberate. The trees provide cover for the machines. The machines can be emplaced without being fully exposed to the city's archers. Batu's engineers, trained in techniques developed in China, know exactly what they are doing. The bombardment begins. For 6 days, stone after stone arcs over the walls of Kyiv, not frantically, methodically. The Mongols are not trying to kill defenders with each shot. They are dismantling a structure. Each impact weakens the mortar between stones, shifts the load and cracks the foundations. Kyiv's walls, while impressive by Rus standards, had not been designed to withstand this kind of sustained mechanical assault. The defenders on the walls fire arrows, pour boiling pitch, and launch whatever projectiles they can manage. But you cannot shoot back at a machine with a bow. Inside the city, the days of bombardment produce a particular kind of psychological terror that is different from the terror of an assault. An assault you can fight. A bombardment you can only endure listening to the steady rhythm of stone hitting. Stone feeling the vibration in the ground beneath your feet, watching the walls get shorter by inches. The chronicles say that by the 5th day, the noise alone, the grinding of siege engines, the crack of impacts, the constant roar of the Mongol camp had made it impossible to hold a normal conversation inside Kyiv's walls. Think about what those 6 days were like for ordinary people, not the soldiers on the walls, but the families below. The mothers are hiding their children in cellars. The priests continued to hold services in churches that shook with each impact, because what else do you do when the world is ending and you still believe that prayer matters? The merchants who had spent their lives building something, a shop, a workshop, a reputation, watching the walls of their city crack and knowing that all of it was going to be erased. The slaves and servants who were owned by the households of Kyiv and had no say in any of the decisions that had led to this moment, who would die just as surely as the princes who had made those decisions. Dmytro and I keep coming back to Dmytro because he is one of the few named individuals whose story we can partially trace through these events, must have known by the fourth or fifth day that the walls were not going to hold. The trebuchets were too many and the bombardment too systematic. He could see the sections of the wall weakening. He could do the arithmetic. And yet the chronicles give no indication that he explored the possibility of negotiation or surrender, possibly because Munka Khan's envoys had already been killed and the offer was gone, possibly because Dmytro himself simply did not have that option in his character. He was a voivode, a war leader. He appears to have chosen to lead the defense to its conclusion and let whatever happened afterward be what it was. There is something in that decision, something about the specific kind of courage that consists not of expecting to win, but of refusing to behave as if defeat has already arrived, that the medieval chroniclers recognized and tried to capture. It is why they recorded his survival. It is why Batu Khan spared him. In a campaign characterized at every level by the total erasure of the defeated, the story of Dmytro is the one small counterpoint, the one moment where the machinery of destruction paused briefly to acknowledge that there was a person inside the rubble. December 6th, 1240, the feast day of St. Nicholas. The walls fail. Not in one place, in multiple places nearly simultaneously, as sections of wall that had been weakened for days finally give way under the combined pressure. The Mongols do not hesitate. They are already formed up, already moving. The breach is seconds old, and Mongol cavalry and infantry are pouring through it. What follows in the streets of Kiev is the kind of fighting that no military doctrine can really prepare you for hand-to-hand building, to building doorway to doorway, with no clear lines and no possibility of retreat for either side. The defenders of Kyiv fight with the specific ferocity of people who have no illusions about what happens when they stop. Dmytro is everywhere in the fighting, directing, rallying, personally engaged, until an arrow finds him and puts him on the ground. By nightfall, the Mongols have secured the outer city. The surviving Kyivans have pulled back toward the center, toward the churches, the high ground, the stone buildings that might offer some last protection. Tens of thousands of people crowd into whatever space they can find. The largest concentration flows into the Church of the Tithes, the oldest stone church in Rus, the building that had stood since 996. The one sacred structure in Kyiv that seemed too solid, too ancient, too permanent to fall. They pack every room, every corridor. They climb to the upper balconies. The weight of thousands of bodies presses against the old stone. And on the morning of December 7th, the balcony of the Church of the Tithes collapses. It gives way under the weight of the people standing on it, a sound like a thunderclap inside a cathedral, and then the roar of the structure coming down, and then silence, and then the screaming. Hundreds of people killed not by Mongol swords, but by the weight of their own desperation. The Mongols take the city in the chaos that follows. The plunder is systematic and total. The fires begin. Dmytro is found in the wreckage still alive, still holding a wound that should have killed him. He is brought before Batu Khan, and Batu, looking at this broken soldier who had killed his envoys, held his city for 9 days and fought until an arrow stopped him, spares his life. In the chronicles phrase, for his bravery. It is the only mercy recorded in the fall of Kyiv. Out of 50,000 people, roughly 2,000 survive. 34 of Kyiv's 40 major buildings are destroyed or burned. 6 remain standing in the ruins. When the papal envoy Giovanni da Pian del Carpini passed through Kiev in 1245, 5 years after the sack, he wrote that he found the roads lined with skulls and bones, and that of the great city he had heard described almost nothing remained. 3 centuries of Kyivan civilization had been reduced in 9 days to a field of bones and ash. December 6, 1240. That is the date historians conventionally give as the end of Kyivan Rus. Not a gradual decline, not a political dissolution, not a succession crisis, a date. 9 days. There is something about that specificity that I find more devastating than any statistics could be. A civilization does not end slowly when a military force like this arrives. It ends on a Tuesday morning when the walls give way. The fall of Kyiv did not end the campaign. It barely slowed it. Batu's army swept west through Galicia and Volhynia, the principalities of southwestern Rus, taking Danilo's cities of Halish and Volodymyr Volynski. By early 1241, the Mongol force had divided again, as it always did, into multiple coordinated columns and entered Central Europe simultaneously. One column smashed through Poland, defeating a coalition army under Henry II the Pious at the Battle of Legnica on April 9, 1241. 2 days later, on April 11th, Subutai annihilated the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi on the Sajo River, killing roughly half of King Bela IV's entire force. The Mongols burned Pest, crossed the frozen Danube, and on Christmas Day, 1241, sacked Esztergom, the most important city in the Kingdom of Hungary. Western Europe was watching. Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire was writing letters. The Pope was issuing appeals. Armies were being discussed. None of them was moving fast enough. What actually saved the West was not a military victory. It was a death. In December 1241, word reached Batu Khan that Ögedei Khan, the Great Khan, the supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire, had died in Mongolia. By Mongol law and custom, every prince of the blood was required to return for the Kurultai, the great council that would choose the next great Khan. Subutai argued against the withdrawal. He believed they could keep going, that Germany and France were within reach, that the Holy Roman Empire would fall the same way everything else had. He was probably right. But the law was the law, and Batu was bound by it. In the spring of 1242, the army turned east. Western Europe would never know how close it had come. What they left behind in Rus was not simply destruction. It was the end of a political and cultural world, and the beginning of something entirely different. Kyiv never recovered. When the first serious traveller's account of the city was written after the conquest, it described a ghost landscape, ruined walls, empty streets, fields of bones. The city that had anchored the entire Kyivan system for 3 centuries became a secondary outpost, overshadowed for generations by Galicia in the southwest and Vladimir in the northeast. Its role as the symbolic heart of Rus civilization, the city where Christianity had been adopted, where the Ruskaya Pravda had been written, where the largest church in the region had stood, was severed. All surviving Rus princes were eventually required to travel to Batu's new capital at Sarai, a city he built on the lower Volga, which became the headquarters of the new Mongol successor state we call the Golden Horde, and kneel before the Khan to receive authorization to rule their own territories. They came one by one on their knees to beg permission to govern their own people. The system the Golden Horde established over Rus was in its way a masterpiece of indirect control. The Mongols did not need to garrison every city or station soldiers at every gate. They did not need to replace the existing administrative structures with their own. Instead, they created a system of dependency so comprehensive that it functioned almost automatically. Every prince who wanted to rule had to travel to Sarai and receive a yarlik, a patent of authority from the Khan. No yarlik meant no legitimate rule, which meant any rival could claim that your authority was invalid. The princes who had spent 2 centuries competing with each other for precedence immediately understood the logic. The fastest path to defeating your Rus rivals was to cultivate better relationships with the Khan than they had. The Mongols had accidentally, or by design, taken the existing competitive structure of Rus politics and turned it into a mechanism of their own control. The tribute system reinforced this at every level. Mongol census takers conducted detailed surveys of the population and its assets, establishing precisely what each territory owed. The Baskaks, Mongol overseers stationed in the major Rus cities, monitored compliance and reported deficiencies. Princes who paid reliably were rewarded with recognition and occasionally military support against their enemies. Princes who failed to pay or who showed signs of building independent power faced punitive expeditions, the Mongol army returning to burn down whatever had been rebuilt since the last time. The threat did not need to be exercised constantly. It only needed to be exercised occasionally and remembered always. For the Orthodox Church, and this is a detail that matters for understanding how Rus culture survived, at all the Mongols adopted a policy of complete religious tolerance. The church paid no tribute. Its clergy was exempt from conscription. Its properties were protected by Mongol law. This was standard Mongol practice across their empire: suppress political resistance absolutely, but leave religious and cultural life largely intact. The practical effect in Russia was that as the political and economic structures of the pre-invasion world collapsed, the church became the one continuous institutional thread connecting the civilization before and after. It preserved literacy. It preserved the chronicles, which is why we know as much as we do about this period. It preserved the memory of what Kyivan Rus had been and kept alive the idea that the Rus people were something distinct, something worth preserving, even when the princes who nominally led them were riding to Sarai to bow before a Mongol Khan. Michael of Chernihiv came. He was the same man who had executed 2 sets of Mongol envoys. Batu's men required him to pass between 2 sacred fires, a traditional Mongol purification ritual, and bow before a tablet of Genghis Khan. Michael refused. He was killed on the spot in September 1246. The Orthodox Church later canonized him as a martyr. The period of Mongol domination over Rus that began with the fall of Kiev in 1240 lasted in various forms until 1480, roughly 240 years. Historians call it the Tatar yoke. It was not uniformly brutal. The Mongols generally allowed the Orthodox Church to function freely, and the princes retained formal authority within their territories as long as the tribute kept flowing. But the tribute was constant. The threat of punitive expeditions was real, and the psychological and structural effects of 2.5 centuries of vassalage ran deep. Here is the legacy question that historians still argue about, and I want to give you my honest read on it. A significant number of serious scholars believe that the Tatar yoke is the primary explanation for what they call the East-West gap, the approximately 200-year lag between Eastern Europe and Western Europe in adopting major political, social, and economic innovations: the Renaissance, the Reformation, representative governance, the scientific revolution, and industrialization. The argument is that Rus was cut off from the developmental trajectory of Western Europe precisely at the moment when Western Europe was beginning to accelerate and never quite caught up. I find this argument largely convincing, with one caveat: Kyivan Rus was already doing significant damage to itself before 1237. The fragmentation, the internal wars, the failure to build lasting institutions, these were problems that existed independently of the Mongols. What the invasion did was take a civilization that was already weakening and apply a shock so severe that normal recovery became impossible. And there is one more irony in all of this that I think deserves a moment. Moscow, the city that would eventually absorb all the successor states of Kyivan Rus, found the Russian Empire, and define Russian civilization for the next 8 centuries, was in 1238 a minor fortified settlement that the Mongols burned on their way to Vladimir. It was basically a footnote. It survived the invasion, not because it was great, but because it was small and unimportant. Under Mongol rule, its princes learned quickly, pragmatically to work within the system. They adopted Mongol administrative structures, the postal road network, the census, the military organization, and the taxation system. They became in some ways the most effective Mongol vassals in Rus. That relationship, that willingness to absorb and adapt, is part of what gave them the organizational edge to eventually dominate their neighbors. The Mongols did not just erase Kyivan Rus, they accidentally created the conditions for Russia. The Cathedral of St. Sophia is still in Kiev. It survived the Mongol sack, survived the centuries of shifting empires, and national boundaries survived the 20th century. which tried very hard in multiple ways to destroy what remained of that ancient city. It stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, its mosaic floors essentially unchanged from the 11th century, looking out over a city that has now, in the 21st century, become the center of a struggle over the very questions of identity and sovereignty that have run through this territory for 1,000 years. I am not going to wade into contemporary politics here. That is not what this channel is for. But I will say this. The reason the history of Kyivan Rus is contested, the reason different nations claim it as their foundational story, the reason the question of what was Kyivan Rus and who are its heirs generates genuine passion, all of that flows directly from December 6, 1240. The shattering of that civilization sent its fragments in different directions, and those fragments developed into different peoples, under different influences, with different historical experiences. The break was real, and it was catastrophic, and its consequences are still with us. What the Mongols created by destroying Kyivan Rus was not a clean slate. It was a fracture one that would spend the next 8 centuries trying to either heal or deepen, depending on who had power at any given moment. There is a lesson in the story of Kyivan Rus that has nothing to do with Mongols specifically, and everything to do with the mechanics of civilizational failure. Kyivan Rus was not destroyed because it was weak. It was destroyed because it was strong in all the ways that didn't matter when it counted militarily capable, culturally sophisticated, economically productive, and weak in the one way that mattered most, the ability of its political leadership to subordinate short-term self-interest to collective survival. Every warning was available. Every piece of information was there. The Battle of Kalka in 1223 had demonstrated exactly what the Mongol army could do. The Friar Julian's letters had described exactly where the army was and when it would move. And yet the princes of Kyivan Rus spent the decade before their destruction competing with each other for the same river towns and inheritance rights they had been fighting over for 2 centuries because those disputes felt real and immediate in a way that the distant threat did not. That is not a medieval problem. That is a permanent feature of how political systems fail. And I think that is why this story, 800 years later, still has the power to disturb. The Mongols are gone. The Golden Horde is gone. Kyivan Rus is gone. But Kyiv is still there, Kyiv on the high western bank of the Dnieper, where it has been for 1,200 years. The Cathedral of St. Sophia is still there. And the questions that tore Kyivan Rus apart, who belongs to what, who owes loyalty to whom, what holds a civilization together when everything external is trying to pull it apart, are still very much alive. History does not repeat itself, but it does with some regularity present very similar problems to new generations and waits to see whether they have learned anything. The evidence on that question is historically speaking mixed. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you. Genuinely. This is not light history. This is not a story about cool battles with cool armor that ends well for everyone. This is a story about what civilizational collapse actually looks like from the inside, and I think it is worth knowing. If you found it valuable, hit subscribe. We cover history like this all the time, the kind that the textbooks summarize in 3 sentences and then move on. There is always more to the story, and if this raised questions for you about the Mongols, about what came next, about the Golden Horde, about Alexander Nevsky, who navigated this period with remarkable skill, leave them in the comments. That is genuinely where the next videos come from. I'll see you in the next one.